All right, so we are looking at PFT 118's chapter 2 and 3 of your Memler's textbook, going through a little bit about chemistry and a little bit about cells today. So um, one of the biggest things that we're going to end up spending some time talking about and what we're going to be looking at today is the idea of like what an organic compound is. So when you hear the word like organic, what that actually means is that it's all of the elements that sort of interact and sort of bond to and have a relationship with the element carbon. If you've ever seen like a sci-fi movie and it's like, oh, it's a carbon-based life form, like we're carbon-based life forms. What that means is that like we use a bit of carbon in most of the things that make up our structures, at least the living parts of us. Now, obviously, if you've ever, been out in the desert before, or I mean, I don't know if I've ever actually seen one in real life out in the desert, but if you've ever watched a cartoon and that character is going through the desert, inevitably they'll come up to like, they'll find like a cow skull or something like that in the middle of the desert, kind of broken down. Generally we see stuff like that left behind, but that's actually the mineralized pieces. Ironically, the stuff that you're seeing that's left behind is kind of the not organic parts of us that's kind of left behind. Or you think about like a pirate skeleton or something like that. The stuff that we sometimes see left behind, that's actually the inorganic parts of us. The organic stuff ends up getting recycled by bacteria and bugs and things like that. But the four main elements that are going to kind of make up the most of the structures in our body are going to be hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, and nitrogen. So those are sort of the four key elements here that all sort of interact together to make up us, right? So if you look at this, I mean, most of our body is actually oxygen molecules, about 65% of it, with about 18% of it being carbon, about 10% of it being hydrogen, and only about 3% being nitrogen. Now, those of you who have actually been through our nutrition class before, you'll know that nitrogen is where we get our amino acids from. So it's kind of funny because you're only seeing about 3% of our body weight is actually nitrogen in those amino acids. The remaining parts of it are oxygen, carbon, and hydrogen. Now, obviously, we also use carbohydrates. We can store about 1% of your body weight actually is sort of glycogen. It's this liquid sugar that you kind of keep hidden in your liver and in all your muscles and stuff. And that is also made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but it doesn't have the nitrogen, which is why it's not a protein. And then fat, obviously we all have a little bit of body fat. And that is, not only like a fuel source for us, similar to carbohydrates, but it's also important for the production of certain, physiologic processes like hormones and things like that. And that fat is made up of the exact same ingredients as a carbohydrate. They're just in a slightly different shape: carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And then obviously we got all these other elements, right? Like the other category here, right? About 4% of your body weight are things like calcium and phosphorus, potassium, sulfur. Sulfur is a pretty good chunk of you. Look at that. It's about 0.3% of your body weight. Yeah, it's the stuff that goes in fireworks. Sodium, chlorine, magnesium. And then there's a whole bunch of little tiny ones like chromium and iron and manganese and molybdenum, and even silicone a little bit. Little tiny bits of other things in there. That's about 0.1% of your body weight. So those are very much itty bitty trace minerals. But you can see like this is all the minerals of these are like little pieces of metal or little pieces of rock, if you want to think of it that way, inside of our body that gives us a little bit of structure, but are obviously a little bit different than what we use to produce energy and what we use to kind of contract and move around and things like that. Like luckily we have a lot of calcium and phosphorus coming together to form what we call calcium phosphate, which is making up our bones, right? This really super hard material. And now I got this really long, kind of hard, lever, then I've got a muscle that can grab, and then it can pull this way and it can move that lever. So we're really lucky that we have this sort of inorganic stuff making up some of our structure, by which we move with all of this, organic stuff. So when you hear me say something is organic, what we mean is that it is something that sort of interacts with carbon. Okay. Um, and there's just kind of another example of like what your body's weight sort of looks like, right? The reason you're mostly oxygen, by the way, is because yes, you are filled with water. We are a very fluid creature. So before we kind of before I dive too much further in, again, taking a look at we're going to steal Crash Course's amazing animations, and then obviously Hank Green's excellent explanations. Let's see here, Crash Course, organic compounds. Cool.
Hello.
All right, so this is actually, I really love this video because like he's gonna make something that is biologically pretty nutritious, but looks disgusting. Which I think is kind of fun. So let's go ahead and talk about proteins, fats, and carbs.
And welcome to the kitchen. I wanted to invite you here today because last week we started off in my bathroom, and I kind of feel bad about that. And also because as I'm making lunch today, I wanted to, sort of use it as a lab. During this time in my kitchen, I'm going to talk to you about 3 different things. 1, the 3 most important molecules on the earth. 2, possibly the grossest sandwich I'm ever going to eat. And 3, an obscure scientist who taught us everything that we know about urine. So far we've talked about carbon and we've talked about water, and now we're going to talk about the molecules that make up every living thing and every living thing in every living thing. I don't care if you're a bacterium, or if you're a blue whale, or if you're Lady Gaga, or if you're a mite living on the Queen of England's eyelashes. They're called biological molecules. These aren't just building blocks. These are the molecules necessary for every living thing on Earth to survive. They are essential sources of energy. They are the means of storing that energy. They are also the instructions that all organisms use to be born, to grow, and ultimately pass those same instructions on to their future generation. They are the ingredients for life. And we call them the carbohydrates, the lipids, the proteins, and the nucleic acids. And today we're just going to be talking about the first 3. It's no coincidence that we classify them in the same way that we classify food, because they're food. And for this classification, we have to thank a little-known English physician who, hundreds of years ago, dedicated his life to the study of human pee.
Oh, my goodness, I'm back in the... That must mean that it's time for the most awkwardly named segment here on Crash Course, the biolography. His name was William Prout, and in the early 1800s he became fascinated with human digestion, especially our urine. And that's because he thought that the best way to understand the human body was through chemistry, and the best way to understand the body's chemistry was to understand what it does to food. By day, he was a practicing physician, but every morning before breakfast he did research in his home laboratory in London. And there he did many great things, like being the first to discover that our stomachs contained hydrochloric acid, and writing a breakthrough book about kidney stones called An Inquiry into the Nature and Treatment of Gravel, Calculus, and Other Diseases Connected with a Deranged Operation of Urinary Organs. And he was, of course, the first person to discover the chemical composition of pure urea, the main component of urine. For the record, here it is, and in the presence of water, urea gives off ammonia, which is why your pee smells. Through his years of studying urine, Prout came to the conclusion that all foodstuffs fell into 3 categories: the saccharinous, carbohydrates, the oleaginous, the fats, and the albuminous, the proteins. He went so far as to say that in order to be healthy, you needed to eat all 3 of these things, not just, sheep kidneys and gin, which is probably what most of London was living on at the time. But like many great minds, Prout was overlooked in his own lifetime because while he was studying actual science, everybody else was walking around believing that the color of your urine was determined by your personality. And this guy looks like a total jerk to me. And if you can tell that much by color, I wonder what you can tell by taste.
Now, he didn't understand that there were biological molecules. He didn't understand what these things were, but he did understand that there were 3 ingredients necessary for life. And it turns out that all organisms either need to synthesize or ingest those ingredients in order to live. We're going to start out with the most basic of these ingredients for life, and that is the carbohydrate. You've no doubt heard of them. You may, in fact, be avoiding them like the plague. But the fact is that nothing and no one can avoid carbohydrates because they are the source of all energy that we have available to us. Carbohydrates are made up of sugars, and the simplest of them are called monosaccharides. Mono for one, saccharides for the actual root of the word sugar. The star of the show here is glucose, because it's truly fundamental, by which I mean like #1 on the global food chain, because it comes from the sun. All biological energy is originally captured from the sun by plants as glucose through photosynthesis. And every cell that needs energy uses glucose to get that energy through a process called respiration. In addition to glucose, there are other monosaccharides like fructose, which has the same molecular formula, C6H12O6, but arranged differently. These subtle chemical differences do matter. Fructose, for example, is significantly sweeter than glucose. It's also processed by our bodies in different ways. And then there are disaccharides, which, like the name says, are just 2 monosaccharides put together. And the most famous of these is sucrose, which is simply a glucose molecule and a fructose molecule joined by a covalent bond. Mono and disaccharides are pretty much little niblets of energy that are really easy for our bodies to process. But when these carbohydrates start to form into longer and longer chains, their function and their roles change as well. Instead of being sources for instant energy, they become storehouses of energy or structural compounds. These are polysaccharides. Instead of being just 2 or 3 monosaccharides put together, polysaccharides can contain thousands of simple sugar units. And because they're so big and burly, they're great for building with. In plants, cellulose is the most common structural compound. It's just a bunch of glucose molecules bound together, and it is the most common organic compound on the planet. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to digest. Cows can do it, but humans certainly cannot, which is why you don't enjoy eating grass. Polysaccharides are also really good for storing energy, and not just structurally, but just as an energy store. And that's where we get bread. Now, really interesting thing here, bread made up of starch, the most simple of which is called amylose. Amylose and cellulose look almost exactly identical, but one is grass and the other is bread. Like, chemistry. Plants store glucose in the form of starch, and it comes in lots and lots of different forms, from roots and tubers to the sweet flesh of fruits to the starchy seeds of the wheat plant that end up being milled into flour. Ground up grain is the main ingredient in the bread, of course, and most of the calories, or the energy content, comes from carbohydrates. When I eat this, and I'm going to eat the hell out of it, I'm going to be eating all of the chemical energy that this wheat plant got from the sun in order to feed its next generation of seeds that we then stole for our own use. All for me. Now, we as human beings can't grow fruits or tubers, so we have to store our energy in a couple of different ways. The way that we tend to store carbohydrate energy is in glycogen, which is very similar to amylose or starch, but has more branches and is more complicated. It's basically made up of the glucose that we have left over after we eat, and it sits in our muscles really ready to use, and it's also stored in our livers. It's generally a pretty short-term store. If we don't eat for like a day, pretty much all of our glycogen gets depleted. But over the longer term, the way that we store our energy is through fat. All of our mom's worst enemies, the fat, which turn out to be actually really important and are the most familiar sort of a very important biological molecule, the lipid. Lipids are smaller and simpler than complex carbohydrates, and they're grouped together because they share an inability to dissolve in water. This is because their chemical bonds are mostly nonpolar. And since water, as we learned in the previous episode, despises nonpolar molecules, the two do not mix. It's like oil and water. In fact, it's exactly like oil and water. And if you've ever read a nutrition label or seen this thing called the television, you're probably pretty conversant in the way that we classify fats. But then, 99% of us have no idea what those classifications actually mean. Fats are made up mainly of 2 chemical ingredients, glycerol, which is a kind of alcohol, and fatty acids, which are long carbon-hydrogen chains that end in a carboxyl group. When you get 3 fatty acid molecules together and connect them to a glycerol, that's a triglyceride. These feature prominently in things like butter and peanut butter and oils and the white parts of meat. These triglycerides can either be saturated or unsaturated, and I know that when we put the word fat and saturated into the same sentence, it sounds like an evening at KFC, but here we're talking about being saturated with hydrogen. As you hopefully remember from our first lesson, carbon is very nimble in how it uses its 4 electrons. It can form single or double or even sometimes triple bonds. This means that if the carbon atoms in a fatty acid are connected to each other with single bonds, all of the carbon atoms end up connected to at least 2 hydrogen atoms, and one of them picks up a third. So the fatty acid is saturated with hydrogen. But when some of the carbon atoms are connected to each other with double bonds, all of those carbon's electrons are spoken for, and so they're not able to pick up those hydrogen atoms. This means that they're not saturated with hydrogen, and they are unsaturated fatty acids. To demonstrate, may I direct your attention to this jar of peanut butter. Here you can kind of see both kinds of fat. The liquid stuff you see at the top here, that is the unsaturated fat, which we generally think of as oils. The pasty stuff down here also contains lots of unsaturated fat, but also contains saturated fat, which doesn't have any double bonds, so it can pack more tightly and form solids at room temperature. And there are also other fat classifications that you've heard of. Trans fats, which everyone tells you never to eat. They're right, don't eat them. They don't exist in nature and are basically unsaturated fatty acids that instead of kinking, go straight across, and so they're extra super bad for you. Don't eat them. Omega-3 fats are fatty acids that are unsaturated at the 3 position, which is like right there. Then that's the only difference. But the reason why these are important is because we can't synthesize them ourselves. They're essential fatty acids, meaning that we need to eat them in order to get them. All this is starting to make me pretty hungry. But before we get to more food stuff, there are some unappetizing sort of lipids that we also need to talk about. So remember that triglycerides are 3 fatty acids connected to a glycerol. Swap one of those fatty acids out for a phosphate group and you have a phospholipid. And these make up cell membrane walls. Since that phosphate group gives that end a polarity, it's attracted to water. And the other end is nonpolar and it avoids water. So if you were to scatter a bunch of phospholipids into some water, they would automatically arrange themselves like this, with the hydrophobic ends facing each other and the hydrophilic ends sticking out to face the water. Every cell in your body uses this natural structure to form its cell wall in order to keep the bad stuff out and the good stuff in. Another class of lipids is the steroids. Steroids have a backbone of 4 interconnected carbon rings, which can be used to form hundreds of variations. The most fundamental of them is cholesterol, which binds with phospholipids to help form cell walls. But these can also be activated to turn into different lipid hormones. And so now we approach the most complicated, powerful, polymorphously awesome chemicals in our body, the protein. And by complicated, I mean that they are probably the most complicated chemical compounds on the planet. In fact, they're so amazing that we're going to do a separate episode on them and how they are created by DNA. But right now, in you, there are tens of thousands of proteins doing everything they can to keep you alive. There are enzymes regulating chemical processes, helping you digest food. There are antibodies connecting themselves to invaders like bacteria and viruses so that your immune system can get them. There are protein endorphins that mess around with your brain and make you feel emotions. They're everywhere. They do everything. And proteins do all of this stuff using just 20 different ingredients, and these are the amino acids. Just like fatty acids, amino acids have a carboxyl group at one end, and on the other end, they have an amino group, amino acid. Now hey, I don't know if you noticed this, but this is the first time that nitrogen has shown up in our food. This is super important because despite the fact that nitrogen is everywhere, it's 80% of the air, we can't just pull it out of the air and put it into our bodies. We have to get nitrogen from food, and so we have to eat foods that are high in protein, like this egg, which by its very virtue, because it is all the white part is protein, it contains a goodly amount of nitrogen. Now in the middle of the amino and the acid group is a carbon, and it shares one of its electrons with good old hydrogen, and the other electron is free to be shared with R, which is just a kind of fill in the blank. We call it the R group. It could also be called a side chain, and there are 20 different kinds of side chains. Whatever fits in that blank will determine the shape and the function of that amino acid. So if you put this in there, you get valine, which is an amino acid that does a lot of stuff like protecting and building muscle tissue. And if you put this in there, you get tryptophan, which may be best known for its role in helping you regulate mood and energy levels. Amino acids form long chains called polypeptides. Proteins are formed when these polypeptides not only connect, but elaborate in, frankly, really elegant structures. They fold, they coil, they twist. If they were sculptures, I would go to the museum every day just to look at them, and I'd walk straight past the nudes without even looking. But protein synthesis is only possible if you have all of the amino acids necessary, and there are 9 of them that we can't make ourselves. Histidine, isoleucine, leucine, lysine, methionine, phenylalanine, threonine, tryptophan, and valine. By eating foods that are high in protein, we can digest them down into their base particles and then use these essential amino acids in building up our own proteins. Some foods, especially ones that contain animal protein, have all of the essential amino acids, including this egg. And that concludes this triple-decker sandwich of biological awesomeness, which is all we need to be happy, healthy people. And I'm sure, because of that, it's going to be delicious. Nope. Thank you for watching this episode of Crash Course. We'll be discussing something else very interesting next week. I don't even know what it is. Don't forget, go back, reinforce what you have learned today by going back and watching bits that you may not feel like you got completely. We'll also, of course, be available on Facebook and Twitter if you would like to ask us questions or give us suggestions there.
All right. So that's a little bit on these organic compounds, right? Of like which we have, you know, a pretty good amount of our body coming from. So when we say organic compounds, again, these are any of the chemicals that you're going to find that are sort of interacting with one another that are going to be found within living creatures, right? Basically, they're primarily built on the element of carbon because carbon's really good at mixing with a lot of other complex things. And so the three main types that we've got are going to be carbohydrates, which are made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And then when we're looking at carbohydrates, we got carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. Those are the main ones. So looking at carbohydrates, we're going to break these down into a couple different categories because there's different examples of carbohydrates out there. One of them is what we call a monosaccharide. And a monosaccharide is a single sugar molecule. The most common example of this is going to be glucose because glucose is what our body prefers to use as a fuel source. So we're not going to dive into like when it comes to energy production today, we're not going to talk about making ATP or anything like that. But basically the way that our bodies make energy is it takes in a molecule of glucose, converts it, and spits out a bunch of energy. So glucose is our body's favorite source of energy. And because a carbohydrate is a big, long chain of lots and lots of glucose, carbohydrates are a really good source of this main energy that we have. So a single sugar molecule like glucose is going to be a mono, which stands for one, saccharide, which stands for sugar. So one sugar molecule or single sugar molecule. Now there are also like slightly more complicated versions of carbohydrates like disaccharides, which are still very, very, very simple. But they're just a little bit more complex than just a single molecule of glucose. So a disaccharide is a double sugar molecule. That's two glucose molecules attached together. Or maybe it's like glucose and fructose, which is also like a single sugar molecule. That's what makes actually sucrose, by the way. Sucrose is table sugar. It's what they add to food. It is not great. Like it is packed full of carbohydrates. You know, we often hear about how like, you know, there's a lot of people out there who are like, oh, carbs are bad for you and this and that. They're making you fat and they're causing diabetes and this and that and blah, 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 blah. And that's not a super accurate depiction of what's actually going on. Don't get me wrong, like sugar is not great. Sugar is, I don't want to say irredeemable, but it's pretty bad. There's really not a lot of upside to sugar. But carbohydrates are actually quite good for us, and they're our body's favorite source of energy. So if you're getting like natural sugars like fructose, that's okay. But when you put glucose with fructose, you get this really sweet substance that is packed full of calories, has very little vitamins and minerals, and is not so great for us. So disaccharides are double sugar molecules. And so that could be two glucose molecules linked together, or like I said, fructose and glucose, or even like the lactose plus glucose and stuff. But imagine you've got those two sugar molecules. So that's actually too large to fit into your bloodstream. A disaccharide, a double sugar molecule, is too big. it can't get into our blood, unfortunately. So we actually need to be able to break that down even further. Once we can actually break that down into individual sugar molecules, then it can get into our bloodstream. And this is part of, like, when we talk about digestion, even if you were to take like a piece of bread and try this out sometime, fair warning, it's going to be really gross when you do. But try this out. Take a slice of bread and kind of, chew it up and leave it in your mouth for a little while. Let it stay in there for longer than you normally would. You will notice that that bread will actually start to taste a little sweet after a while, in kind of a not good way, but it'll taste a little sweet. And what that is that is actually that big, long, complex bread carbohydrate being broken down into disaccharides. Because the enzymes in your saliva are actually able to do that, but they're not able to get it all the way broken down into single sugar molecules. That's where the rest of your digestive tract is going to come in. So disaccharides are double sugar molecules, right? Another good example of that is lactose, which is glucose plus galactose. And lactose is a disaccharide that not everybody can break down. You need to have a special enzyme called lactase, which is going to break down lactose into galactose and glucose. It'll break it down into monosaccharides. So if you can't break that double sugar molecule down because you don't have that enzyme, you are what we call lactose intolerant. And the reason lactose intolerance often causes like a lot of gastrointestinal distress and gas and things like that and cramping is because this sugar molecule doesn't get broken down into single sugar molecules. It stays as a double, and so it doesn't get into your bloodstream, and then it just keeps passing its way all the way through your digestive tract until eventually it gets to your large intestine, where you have a lot of gut bacteria living in there. And we love our gut bacteria. They are, these little critters that we need to kind of help us break food down and keep our body running and doing a lot of really important stuff. But it is bacteria, it is sort of a living organism that has its own digestive process where it eats and poops stuff out. And that makes a lot of gas very, very rapidly, which often causes cramping and gastrointestinal distress and things like that. So if anybody out there is lactose intolerant, you've even wondered like what that is, well, that's exactly what's happening. It's basically this inability to break down one specific type of a disaccharide. And then we've also got polysaccharides. Poly, which stands, and by the way, di stands for two. Again, saccharide stands for sugar, so two sugars. Poly stands for many. So this is a many sugar molecule or multiple sugar molecules. The best example of this is probably going to be like the starches that you're going to find in like bread or potatoes, rice, couscous, whatever, all the big complex carbs that are out there. When you hear someone say complex carb, they are talking oftentimes about starchy carbs or carbs that have like bits of fiber in them. Fiber is just if we think of like poly as like a many sugar molecule, fiber is like a polycomplex sugar molecule. It's like a poly sugar molecule. It's like a really dense, super complicated carbohydrate. In fact, fiber is so complicated that our body can't break it down. It actually goes through our digestive tract completely uninterrupted because our digestive enzymes, our digestive materials, we're just not good enough at breaking down fiber. And that's kind of a good thing because it will drag anything that we're leaving in this sort of empty tube out of our body. And that's why fiber sort of, can clean you out. And so that's also how we feed that gut bacteria that I talked about. So these are multiple sugar molecules all chained together in big complicated chains. Now, one of the versions of that is also going to be what is referred to as glycogen. Glycogen is actually a polysaccharide. It's a starch that your body actually assembles. So yesterday we talked about anabolic versus catabolic reactions. Catabolic reactions break stuff down. Anabolic reactions build stuff up. So when you have like a big complicated starch, like let's say like a russet potato, right? You're having a baked potato while you're at a restaurant. Right, you eat that whole thing. That's a big, complicated polysaccharide starch, right? So then that's going to get broken down. Some of it's going to get broken down in your saliva. The rest of it's going to get broken down in the rest of your digestive tract until eventually you're left with monosaccharides in the form of glucose. And now all of that glucose is going to pass into your bloodstream. And your body's going to go, great, well, we're leaving the restaurant right now and I'm walking to the car. So I'm going to use a little bit of that glucose to fuel me with the energy to walk to the car, but man, it didn't take that much energy. There was more calories worth of energy in that potato than there was to walk to the car. So now I got all this extra stuff. I'm going to leave some in the blood so that like, you know, I can keep my blood sugar levels ready in case I need to, you know, jump out of this car for any reason and walk around. Keep the body, you know, moving and awake and active and stuff. But the rest of it, let's see, I'm going to create a little bit of insulin. So then your body creates a little bit of insulin and it drives some of that sugar out of your blood and stores it. Now, the way our body stores glucose is it will either convert it into fat and store it in our fat cells, or it will leave it as a carbohydrate, but it will reassemble it into its own version of a starch, which we call glycogen. So again, starch is a big complex carb. And you actually can create starches inside your own body. I mean, we make carbohydrates by assembling sugar molecules back together in this kind of complicated form. It's not quite as solid as you would find in rice or bread or a potato or something like that. But it's sort of a liquidy. It has a lot of water in it. In fact, it actually looks kind of similar if you've ever boiled a pot of potatoes and you see that kind of scum that kind of seeps to the top of, you know, you can kind of scrape it off the top of your potatoes sometimes. What that actually is kind of similar to glycogen because there's a lot of water in there, and that's basically just like individual little sugar molecules that kind of, you know, broke off because of the extreme heat and the boiling and stuff, and then they all started kind of clumping together, and that's why you see that scum. But that's glycogen. Your body is going to assemble and hold on to carbohydrates within its own body. And so we need to make sure that we have plenty of glycogen in our body at any given time, because that is our stored energy, right? If I were to walk out of here right now and, you know, strap on my headphones and go for a 3-mile run, my body is going to rely on any of the glycogen that it has stored in my body. It'll break some of it down from my liver, and it'll break some of it down from the muscles that I'm using to go on this run. So then next time I go eat some carbohydrates, well, you know, it's going to restore those glycogen stores. So those are carbohydrates, right? And here's a kind of an example of them, right? You can see we've got fructose and glucose. Glucose is the big one that we talk about a lot. Galactose, that's one found in milk. Fructose found in sugars and stuff. And then there's some actually interesting ones that we don't talk about too often, but like ribose and deoxyribose. Those are sugars that are found in your DNA, which is kind of cool. They give you a little backbone before, you know, some of the amino acids come in and make up the rest of your DNA. Then there's disaccharides like sucrose. That's the devil's sugar. That's glucose plus fructose. If you took regular glucose and added it to a fruit sugar, so that's 2 single sugar molecules added together. There's maltose, which is glucose plus glucose. That's going to be found in milk. And then there's galactose plus glucose, which is going to be what we call lactose, and that's going to be found in milk as well. And that's why milk has so much sugar in it. 2 different types of sugars found inside. Polysaccharides, we've got glycogen. One that I also didn't talk about, that I never talk about because, I mean, you can eat them, but it's not that common, is also, you're going to see what is called chitin. Chitin is what makes bugs kind of crunchy. It's actually, their exoskeleton is actually made out of a polysaccharide. It's very fibrous, and that's why if you ever you ever look at like bug protein powder, which is a real thing, by the way, that I've had. It's not that bad. I had some protein cricket brownies once. This will be great because now I'll just have this on my suggested like feed from now on. But if you look at it's high in protein and it has like 3 grams of fiber in it, which you don't normally find. There you go. It's cricket protein powder. But yeah, that's going to be from the fiber is from the chitin. And then there's cellulose, which is what we refer to as fiber. That is the stuff that we really cannot break down. Starches, which is the complex stuff that we can break down. And, there's glucose, right? And then there are like yeasts and bacteria as well. So this is what that kind of looks like. You can see here, here's an individual sugar molecule, and there's a bunch of sugar molecules all linked together. And that's what your glycogen looks like, or, that might be what a starchy carb looks like that you're going to eat or something. So that's sort of our favorite source of energy. Our second favorite source of energy are going to be our lipids, which we more commonly refer to as fats. But these are organic compounds because they are made, they got a little bit of carbon on the backbone, and they are also made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So the same ingredients that made up carbohydrates, which again, explains why they are so good at being used for energy. They're actually a little bit simpler than carbohydrates. And so there's going to be a couple different versions of lipids out there. The most common of which is going to be triglycerides, which is stands for, so lipids are built on their backbone is what is called glycerol, which is a specific type of like a little alcohol. And so like we call these a triglyceride. And so that's 3 fatty acids attached to a glycerol backbone. So it's a simple fat with a glycerol backbone and 3 fatty acids attached to it. That's what makes it a triglyceride. So if I look up a picture of a triglyceride here, you can see here's the sort of chemical version of it. Looks something kind of like this, where it's like there's the glycerol backbone and then fatty acid, fatty acid, fatty acid, right? I like to see them drawn kind of like this. I always think this is a little bit of a better picture. You can see they're kind of squiggly, which I think makes sense when you think about fats because they're real oily and movable and stuff. But either way, however you want to draw them, that's what a triglyceride is. And so you can see, actually, here's a good picture. There's the glycerol molecule and there's a fatty acid, and you slap 3 fatty acids on there, and that's where we get it. So when you think of like the saturated fats that you are consuming in your diet, or unsaturated fats you're getting in your diet, whether that's like animal fat or if it is, olive oil and things like that, you are getting a substantial amount of triglycerides. You're also getting diglycerides. That stands for 2 fatty acids attached to a glycerol backbone. But that's what we refer to as a phospholipid. And so this is also a complex lipid, and this has a little bit of phosphorus and 2 fatty acids attached to it. So phospholipids look a little bit different. Instead of having 3 tails, these have only 2, and so they look something kind of like this, right? There's like a little, 2 tails, right? But instead of having like a glycerol backbone, this instead has a little bit of phosphorus at its head. And phosphorus is actually attracted to water. But fatty acids are not. Fatty acids are actually what we call hydrophobic. They are afraid of water. And so if you've ever noticed, like when you drop fat into water, right? If we look at like oil in water, it kind of looks like this, right? It kind of clumps up, and then it all kind of floats to the top there, right? That's what it ends up kind of looking like in the end. That is because fats are very attracted to each other, and what they'll do is they'll actually naturally form this kind of shape right here, where the phosphorus ends will face outwards and the lipid ends will face inwards. And this is actually what we're about to get into in the second half of today's class. When we talk about our cells, this is what our cell membranes actually look like. This, we have a lot of water inside of our body, but we also have water inside of our cells and we have water outside of our cells, right? So we need to be able to keep water inside and water outside, and every now and then trade stuff, from one end to the other and be able to pass it through the wall. But we don't want to just be leaking all of our water out. We need to have it, very, very organized. And so our cell walls are made up of these phospholipids. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important to have omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids in your diet, because they are going to make up your actual cell walls. And then you've also got steroids, which are a little bit different when it comes to fats, but these actually have like a carbon ring around the outside. And these are things like your cholesterols, your steroid hormones, your sex hormones. All of those are really good examples of steroids inside. And so like that would be like a little bit of a single fatty acid with like a carbon ring instead. And the ring gives it this very interesting shape, which allows it to kind of interact with our body in very unique ways compared to the other fats. So when we're talking about fatty acids, particularly when we're talking about triglycerides and how we consume triglycerides, we are going to talk about them in either saturated or unsaturated forms, okay? So saturated fatty acids are how your body assembles fatty acids. So if your body takes in a bunch of fat and assembles it together, it will actually do that by storing a bunch of triglycerides and saturating those triglycerides with hydrogen, because we have lots of hydrogen in our body and stuff. So this is what a saturated fatty acid is, or a saturated fat is. It's a fat that is saturated with hydrogen. So if you take a look right here, you can see this is a saturated fat right here. And I always like to think of it as like, if you think about like this carbon here is representing like a dining table, every seat is filled at that dining table, right? So it's saturated. Every seat's filled up. It's saturated with hydrogen, people sitting there. So that, is a nice straight line, which means it can stack pretty efficiently, which is why saturated fats are typically solid at room temperature, because they can stack very, very, very efficiently, and what makes something a solid is the molecules are more tightly packed. Liquids are less tightly packed, and then gases are really not tightly packed at all. So that's what a saturated fatty acid is going to look like. An unsaturated fatty acid is a fat that actually has spaces for hydrogen to bind. They have a little bit of empty space. There's some seats left at the table, right? We can see here, this is oleic acid. This is a mono unsaturated fat. Mono stands for one. So this has one kink in it, one empty space, which is, spots you can see for probably about 2 hydrogen there. But there's one kink. There's also linolenic acid, which is a polyunsaturated fat. So that's poly again for many. So that's many seats available at the table. And so like, that's what we're going to kind of see. And so monounsaturated fats are usually liquid at room temperature, because you don't really see it in this picture here, but normally when there's a seat at the table, when there's that like little empty space, there's also like a kink in it. And that kink means that like it can't stack very well, and that's what makes it a liquid. And then, polyunsaturated, there's lots of kinks. There's a lot of those. So that's the difference between saturated and unsaturated fats. So here's how your body's actually going to sort of form these things. This is how your body's going to kind of assemble them. It's going to create a little glycerol, and it's going to attach a fatty acid, and that's a monoglyceride. Or maybe it attaches 2 fatty acids. That's a diglyceride. Or if it attached 3 fatty acids, that would be a triglyceride. And your body stores triglycerides inside of our fat cells. That's what a fat cell is it's what's known as an adipocyte, which is why we call it adipose tissue. And adipocytes look kind of like your classic animal cell. There's really, a little nucleus and other materials in there and stuff, but they've got this big empty sac, this fat reservoir, and your body will store triglycerides in that. And the more triglycerides it has, the larger the fat cell is, but they can only get so large. So then eventually they divide and they copy themselves. And then you have two fat cells, and, now those can get filled up. And this is why, it's not great to cycle your body weight, because your body makes more and more and more fat cells. So that's sort of the difference between our fats there. Now, the last organic compound that we have got is going to be protein. Protein is the most complex out of all of them. It's the really cool one. And this has carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in it as well, but it also has nitrogen. And nitrogen is what allows proteins to have these really cool shapes. Nitrogen's really good at sort of folding itself around or twisting and, having all these really, really kind of interesting shapes. And, if we look at like examples of proteins, yeah, not quite getting a picture like I want. Enzymes, DNA. Okay, that kind of works, I guess. That's kind of what I'm looking for. So you can see there's a lot of different kind of interesting looking proteins, right? Some of them are, in this shape of like DNA. Some of them are in this shape of like, your blood cells. There's proteins in that. Hormones are proteins. Your skin is protein. Your nails are made of protein. There's a lot of really cool proteins in our body, and it's because they can shape themselves in these really cool, funky shapes thanks to nitrogen. It allows them to sort of change their shape in really unique ways. There we go. That's actually kind of what I'm looking for a little bit, right? You can see kind of very interesting shapes. Now, when I say that like they are in these interesting shapes, what I mean to say is that the building blocks of proteins are what we call an amino acid. Okay, so there are 20 different amino acids out there in the universe. And what an amino acid is, right? It's an organic compound that has specialized little side chains of nitrogen, which is what's giving them their unique shape. So if you took something that's kind of similar to a carbohydrate, carbon, oxygen, hydrogen here, right? You can see those are all the same ingredients, but there's a little bit of nitrogen over here. And then there's this interesting little R right here. So that R is what is known as an R group, or sometimes it's known as like a side chain. And that is going to have a very unique shape to it, depending on which amino acid it is. So there's going to be 20 variations. And that's why they just kind of use the letter R. It's like, look, this R just kind of represents any of the unique 20 variations that we're going to see in the universe, right? So there are 20 different amino acids, okay? And these are all of them. You've probably heard of some of them before. I don't know if anybody in here has ever taken like beta alanine as like a supplement, or if you've ever taken glutamine, or, sometimes you'll see, in like energy drinks and stuff, you'll see like it'll have like actually it'll have like tyrosine and valine. There's a lot of different like amino acids out there, right? And they got their little letter symbols over here, but usually they're abbreviated with 3. But here's what's really cool about proteins. A protein is a big complex chain of amino acids. So all 20 of those amino acids coming together. So think about like making a protein as like the world's greatest chef, right? Like this is like a chef who can literally create any recipe in the entire world with only 20 ingredients. But that chef will not start working unless they have all 20 ingredients in front of them. So they won't assemble anything unless there's all 20 ingredients. Now, here's the thing. A couple of those amino acids, the chef can actually make. So like, think of it this way. The analogy I always use is like, if you've got garlic as one of our main ingredients and salt is another one of our main ingredients, and garlic salt is also a main ingredient. It's like, well, why does it need to be that? Well, it's part garlic, it's part salt. Let's say that chef needs all 20 ingredients to make whatever recipe he needs to make. But let's say he's missing garlic salt. Well, he can break down those two other ones to make it. And that's the difference between what we call essential amino acids and non-essential amino acids. Non-essential amino acids are like the garlic salt. Your body can create those by breaking down other amino acids and kind of changing their shape a little bit. But the essential amino acids, our body can't do that. We need to get them in our diet. So you need to make sure that you have a balanced protein intake when it comes to your diet. We want to make sure that we have a very balanced way that we are eating things, a combination of beans and rices and quinoas and different proteins from different sources, and that's going to help us balance out that amino acid profile. Now, talking about proteins, one of the really cool ones that we should discuss, a type of protein inside of your body. You got so many different types of proteins, right? I mean, like there's, look at just like a classic like animal cell. You just look at like a regular old cell, all these little things, these are all made up of proteins, like those are all different types of proteins. But then you've also got actin and myosin and your skin cells and your hair cells. You got the whatever's making your eyes the color that they are. There's melanin, unless you got blue eyes, in which case you're missing the melanin. But like if you've got all these different types of proteins and all these kind of different shapes, one of the coolest ones are your enzymes. Enzymes are proteins that your body makes that actually kick off metabolic reactions. So enzymes are actually responsible for a good portion of our metabolism. Remember we talked about earlier, I said catabolically, we break carbohydrates down. Some of it happens in your spit. That's because of an enzyme called salivary amylase. That enzyme breaks apart those carbohydrates. So it kicks off this chemical reaction to break down carbs. Well, guess what? You also need enzymes to make glycogen. I can't remember what it's called. God dang it. My friend two of my friends had a baby recently, and she has a fairly Pompei's disease. That's what it is. She has a pretty rare disease called Pompei's disease. And what it actually is, it is actually where her muscles are creating this extra enzyme that it really shouldn't be creating, and that breaks down their glycogen. And it breaks that glycogen down and like releases it into their blood, and then that basically keeps them from being able to use glycogen the way it's supposed to. So it's kind of a rare thing, and luckily you can we have ways that we can kind of synthetically make that enzyme and stuff, but and luckily for her it's very, 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 very minor. But that's a special enzyme, right? It's basically creating this reaction, and it's like, I kind of don't want that reaction, but those are the different types of enzymes that we've got throughout our body. We got all kinds of them, and they kick off all these really, really cool things. So when I say that they kick off a metabolic reaction, sometimes we refer to enzymes as a lock and key mechanism. I always like to use this analogy and say that an enzyme is kind of like the key to your car. It doesn't have any energy, right? Your car gets energy from gasoline, right? But you can't start using that gasoline unless you stick the key in the ignition and turn it. When you turn it, that starts the chemical reaction that starts using gasoline. That's kind of how enzymes work. Here's just some pictures of this is what we're seeing here is like what's called a nucleotides. That's going to be like your found in your DNA. Here's ribose, and again also found in DNA and stuff. your DNA is probably the coolest freaking protein out there. It contains all of your genetic information. It's your genetic code. And, you know, we see when we look at DNA, it's in this very cool shape. It's as we call it, a double helix. And basically, it's got your blueprint for how to make new versions of you in there. And so, you know, it's all of these really cool little little amino acids all coming together to form this really unique looking protein. And basically it can kind of peel itself off and recreate like the other half of itself. We call that transcribing. And that's how you make new stuff. So those are our organic compounds. Any questions, comments, or concerns on that? Babe, Derek, Cody, Derek, Lorianne. Questions, comments, concerns?
No, sir.
All righty.
Good.
Cool. It is a lot. It's kind of a lot to say. But remember, like, never forget, I will always talk about more stuff than actually makes it into the notes. The notes is meant to be kind of a filter. It's like, this is the important stuff. But you guys know, I like to talk. All right, so let's look at cells. This is my favorite part. So love talking about cells. Cells are super, super cool. The basic unit for life. You know, this is like what makes you, again, like kind of organic, right? Is you're this big clump of cells. So we're going to be looking, we're actually not going to be looking at microscopes. Again, that's not something that's super relevant to us. But we will be looking at cell structures, you know, what's going to be found inside of them, all the organelles and materials and stuff. We'll talk a little bit about like how membranes allow stuff into our cells and out of our cells, very similarly to how you let food into your body and out of your body, right? We'll talk a little bit about protein synthesis, a little bit about DNA, just because it's kind of fun. Although, to be fair, it's not a huge part of our role in things. Cell division and meiosis and mitosis and things like that, a little bit of that. We'll talk a little bit about how our cells age and then what happens if our cells become compromised. But before we do, I got one heck of an animal. Sometimes cells are hard to understand or hard to study because, you know, you don't get to see them. You know, it's not something you can kind of hold and view very easily. So love this video because it's got some really great animations here. But if we look at Cariopolis.
Sorry guys, I can't come to lunch.
This
I'm already staring sound, right?
is an animal.
Staring sound. Okay, here we go.
This is an animal. And this is also an animal. An animal, animal, animal carcass, animal, animal, animal carcass, again, animal. The thing that all of these other things have in common is that they're made out of the same basic building block, the animal cell. Animals are made up of your run-of-the-mill eukaryotic cells, and these are called eukaryotic because they have a true kernel in the Greek, a good nucleus, and that contains the DNA and calls the shots for the rest of the cell, also containing a bunch of organelles. There's a bunch of different kinds of organelles and they all have very specific functions, and all of this is surrounded by the cell membrane. Of course, plants are eukaryotic cells too, but they're set up a little bit differently. Of course, they have organelles that allow them to make their own food, which is super nice. We don't have those. And also their cell membrane is actually a cell wall. It's made of cellulose. It's rigid, which is why plants can't dance. If you want to know all about plant cells, we did a whole video on it. And you could click on it here if it's online yet. It might not be. A lot of the stuff in this video is going to apply to all eukaryotic cells, which includes plants and fungi and protists. Now, rigid cell walls, that's cool and all, but one of the reasons that animals have been so successful is that their flexible membrane, in addition to allowing them the ability to dance, gives animals the flexibility to create a bunch of different cell types and organ types and tissue types that could never be possible in a plant. The cell walls that protect plants and give them structure prevent them from evolving complicated nerve structures and muscle cells that allow animals to be such a powerful force for, eating plants. Animals can move around, find shelter and food, find things to mate with, all that good stuff. In fact, the ability to move oneself around using specialized muscle tissue has been 100% trademarked by Kingdom Animalia.
What about protozoans?
Excellent point. What about protozoans? They don't have specialized muscle tissue. They move around with cilia and flagella and that kind of thing. So way back in 1665, British scientist Robert Hooke discovered cells with his kind of crude beta version microscope. He called them cells because they looked like bare Spartan monks' bedrooms with not much going on inside. Hooke was a smart guy and everything, but he could not have been more wrong about what was going on inside of a cell. There is a whole lot going on inside of a eukaryotic cell. It's more like a city than a monk's cell. In fact, let's go with that. A cell is like a city. It has defined geographical limits, a ruling government, power plants, roads, waste treatment plants, a police force, industry, all the things a booming metropolis needs to run smoothly. But this city does not have one of those hippie governments where everybody votes on stuff and talks things out at town hall meetings and crap like that. Nope. Think fascist Italy circa 1938. Think Kim Jong-un's North Korea, and you might be getting a closer idea of how eukaryotic cells do their business. Let's start out with city limits. So as you approach the city of Eukaryopolis, there's a chance that you will notice something that a traditional city never has, which is either cilia or flagella. Some eukaryotic cells have either one or the other of these structures, cilia being a bunch of tiny little arms that wiggle around and flagella being one long whip-like tail. Some cells have neither. Sperm cells, for instance, have flagella and our lungs, and throat cells have cilia that push mucus up and out of our lungs. Cilia and flagella are made out of long protein fibers called microtubules, and they both have the same basic structure. 9 pairs of microtubules forming a ring around 2 central microtubules. This is often called the 9+2 structure. Anyway, that's just so you know when you're approaching the city, watch out for the cilia and flagella. If you make it past the cilia, you will encounter what is called a cell membrane, which is a kind of squishy, not rigid plant cell wall, which totally encloses the city and all of its contents. It's also in charge of monitoring what comes in and out of the cell, kind of like the fascist border police. The cell membrane has selective permeability, meaning that it can choose what molecules come in and out of the cells for the most part. And I did an entire video on this, which you can check out right here. Now, the landscape of Eukaryopolis, important to note, is kind of wet and squishy. It's a bit of a swampland. Each eukaryotic cell is filled with a solution of water and nutrients called cytoplasm. And inside of this cytoplasm is a scaffolding called the cytoskeleton. It's basically just a bunch of protein strands that reinforce the cell. Centrosomes are a special part of this reinforcement. They assemble long microtubules out of proteins that act like steel girders that hold all the city's buildings together. The cytoplasm provides the infrastructure necessary for all the organelles to do all of their awesome, amazing business, with the notable exception of the nucleus, which has its own kind of cytoplasm called the nucleoplasm, which is a more luxurious, premium environment befitting the cell's beloved leader. But we'll get to that in a minute. First, let's talk about the cell's highway system. The endoplasmic reticulum, or just ER, are organelles that create a network of membranes that carry stuff around the cell. These membranes are phospholipid bilayers, same as in the cell membrane. There are 2 types of ER. There's the rough and the smooth. Fairly similar, but slightly different shapes, slightly different functions. The rough ER looks all bumpy because it has ribosomes attached to it, and the smooth ER doesn't, so it's a smooth network of tubes. Smooth ER acts as a kind of factory warehouse in the cell city. It contains enzymes that help with the creation of important lipids, which you'll recall from our talk about biological molecules, phospholipids and steroids that turn out to be sex hormones. Other enzymes in the smooth ER specialize in detoxifying substance, like noxious stuff derived from drugs and alcohol, which they do by adding a carboxyl group to them, making them soluble in water. Finally, the smooth ER also stores ions in solutions that the cell may need later on, especially sodium ions, which are used for energy in muscle cells. So the smooth ER helps make lipids, while the rough ER helps in the synthesis and packaging of proteins. And those proteins are created by another type of organelle, the ribosome. Ribosomes can float freely throughout the cytoplasm or be attached to the nuclear envelope, which is where they're spat out from. And their job is to assemble amino acids into polypeptides. As the ribosome builds an amino acid chain, the chain is pushed into the ER. When the protein chain is complete, the ER pinches it off and sends it to the Golgi apparatus. And the city that is the cell, the Golgi is the post office, processing proteins and packaging them up before sending them wherever they need to go. Calling it an apparatus makes it sound like a bit of complicated machinery, which it kind of is because it's made up of like these stacks of membranous layers that are sometimes called Golgi bodies. The Golgi bodies can cut up large proteins into smaller hormones and can combine proteins with carbohydrates to make various molecules, like for instance, snot. The bodies package these little goodies into sacs called vesicles, which have phospholipid walls just like the main cell membrane, then ship them out either to other parts of the cell or outside the cell wall. We learn more about how vesicles do this in the next episode of Crash Course.
The Golgi bodies also put the finishing touches on the lysosomes. Lysosomes are basically the waste treatment plants and recycling centers of the city. These organelles are basically sacs full of enzymes that break down cellular waste and debris from outside of the cell and turn it into simple compounds which are transferred into the cytoplasm as new cell-building materials.
Now, finally, let us talk about the nucleus, the beloved leader. The nucleus is a highly specialized organelle that lives in its own double-membraned, high-security compound with its buddy, the nucleolus. And within the cell, the nucleus is in charge in a major way. Because it stores the cell's DNA, it has all the information the cell needs to do its job. So the nucleus makes all the laws for the city and orders all the other organelles around, telling them how and when to grow, what to metabolize, what proteins to synthesize, how and when to divide. The nucleus does all this by using the information blueprinted in its DNA to build proteins that will facilitate a specific job getting done. For instance, on January 1st, 2012, let's say a liver cell needs to help break down an entire bottle of champagne. The nucleus in that liver cell would start telling the cell to make alcohol dehydrogenase, which is the enzyme that makes alcohol not alcohol anymore. This protein synthesis business is complicated. Lucky for you, we will have, or may already have, an entire video about how it happens. The nucleus holds its precious DNA along with some proteins in a web-like substance called a chromatin. When it comes time for the cell to split, the chromatin gathers into rod-shaped chromosomes, each of which holds DNA molecules. Different species of animals have different numbers of chromosomes. We humans have 46, fruit flies have 8. Hedgehogs, which are adorable, but less complex than humans, have 90. Now the nucleolus, which lives inside of the nucleus, is the only organelle not enveloped by its own membrane. It's just a gooey splotch of stuff within the nucleus. Its main job is creating ribosomal RNA, or rRNA, which it then combines with some proteins to form the basic units of ribosomes. Once these units are done, the nucleolus spits them out of the nuclear envelope where they are fully assembled into ribosomes. The nucleus then sends orders in the form of messenger RNA, or mRNA, to those ribosomes, which are the henchmen that carry out the orders in the rest of the cell. How exactly the ribosomes do this is immensely complex and awesome. So awesome, in fact, that we're going to give it the full crash course treatment, an entire episode. And now for what is, totally objectively speaking, of course, the coolest part of the animal cell, its power plants, the mitochondria, the smooth, oblong organelles where the amazing and super important process of respiration takes place. This is where energy is derived from carbohydrates, fats, and other fuels and is converted into adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, which is like the main currency that drives life in Eukaryopolis. You can learn more about ATP and respiration in an episode that we did on that. Now, of course, some cells, like muscle cells or neuron cells, need a lot more power than the average cell in the body, and so those cells have a lot more mitochondria per cell. But maybe the coolest thing about mitochondria is that long ago, animal cells didn't have them, but they existed as their own sort of bacterial cell. And one day, one of these things ended up inside of an animal cell, probably because the animal cell was trying to eat it. But instead of eating it, it realized that this thing was really super smart and good at turning food into energy, and it just kept it. It stayed around. And to this day, they sort of act like their own separate organisms, like they do their own thing within the cell, they replicate themselves, they even contain a small amount of DNA. Now, what may be even more awesome, if that's possible, is that Mitochondria are in the egg cell when an egg gets fertilized. And those mitochondria have DNA. But because mitochondria replicate themselves in a separate fashion, it doesn't get mixed with the DNA of the father. It's just the mother's mitochondrial DNA. That means that your and my mitochondrial DNA is exactly the same as the mitochondrial DNA of our mothers. And because this special DNA is isolated in this way, scientists can actually track back and back and back and back to a single mitochondrial Eve who lived about 200,000 years ago in Africa. All of that complication and mystery and beauty in one of the cells of your body. It's complicated, yes, but worth understanding. Review time! Another somewhat complicated episode of Crash Course Biology. If you want to go back and watch any of the stuff that we talked about it to reinforce it in your brain, if you didn't quite get it, just click on the links and it'll take you back in time to when I was talking about that mere minutes ago. Thank you for watching. If you have questions for us, please ask below in the comments or on Twitter or on Facebook, and we will do our best to make things more clear for you. We'll see you next time.
Okay. All right. Let's take a look at cells, shall we? So the basic unit for all of our life, right? Like you are made up of all these really cool different types of cells all kind of coming together. And we are going to beat them up in the gym. We are going to break them, we're going to damage them, and then they are going to grow back, only they're going to grow back a little bit stronger than they were last time. So in order to understand, when we get to muscles, how we are going to, build all these really cool cells, because muscle cells are probably my favorite type of cell to talk about. Those neurons, I think those are just so freaking cool. We need to kind of understand sort of the basic blueprint of a cell. So at its most basic, this is what they're going to kind of look like. To be fair, I don't think there's actually that many cells in your body that actually look like this, but this is a really good diagram of a cell. It doesn't have any of the special materials that you're going to find in particular cells, but it has everything that every cell kind of does have in it. So cells have around the outside of them, the first thing you're going to see is they are going to have what is known as a plasma membrane. This is your outermost layer of your cell. It's the wall that's separating materials from the inside and the outside. And it is kind of hairy on the outside, which is always kind of easy to remember because animal cells are hairy, because it's got all this stuff that's known as cilia along the outside, which are little proteins that basically move materials around. So when we look at your plasma membrane, actually, you can see it right here, and you can see all the little cilia and stuff on the outside. Let's see, am I going to get a good picture? Yeah, here's kind of what that plasma membrane actually kind of looks like. It is a phospholipid, those fats that we talked about earlier, double layer or a bilayer. And so you can see there's two layers of phospholipids, right? And so it's forming that shell that I talked about earlier, where we're using fats to keep certain materials in and certain materials out. And then this is a specialized protein right here. This is a channel that can open up and allow certain materials to pass inside, but it can also allow other materials to pass out. And so here, for instance, is a carbohydrate. And so this little sugar needs to get into the cell so the cell can use it to produce energy. Well, it's going to get through using these little channels. Kind of similar to the Panama Canal, like you got this river, and it closes down, but then it opens up and allows the ship to pass through and closes back down afterwards. So there's a lot of really cool stuff on the outside. We've got channels, which are little pores that allow the passage of, specifically shaped things. There might be picture it as like a hexagon shape for one material, or maybe a square shape for another material. There's transporters, which are actually things that can carry stuff from one side of the wall to the other. There's receptors, which actually allow one cell to interact with another, which is hugely important, especially when we're talking about like nerve cells, for instance. So when something happens in one cell and then it recepts with the other one, or even just like you think about like caffeine, caffeine is shaped really similar to these, what we call neurotransmitters. And it binds with this little receptor inside of our cell and makes your brain go, oh, I should be awake right now. Enzymes are going to be on the outside of our cells to allow chemical reactions to occur. Linkers, which are allowing them to attach one to another. That's hugely important because, we got a whole bunch of linkers in our skin cells, for instance. Skin is what we know as like epithelial tissue, where it's like a bunch of little cells all kind of stacked together. And then there's like your cell identity markers. These are the ones that like have your little name tags on them. And so let's say like a virus gets into your body and it doesn't have like your name tag on it. Well, without that identity marker, that's how your body goes, hey, you're not supposed to be in here. And it eats it. It takes it to virus gel. So a lot of really cool little things on the outside of that double membrane, that plasma membrane. But it is what is known as a phospholipid bilayer, meaning that it's 2 layers of phospholipids that are keeping fluids either on the inside or on the outside of our cells. And like I said, there are some really cool materials in that plasma membrane. You've got channels, which is allowing stuff in. There's also pumps, which is kind of similar to a channel, except they can burn up a little bit of energy to force stuff from one side to another. So for those of you who have been through our physiology class, you'll remember that we talked about action potentials, right? We talked about generating electrochemical charge within our cells, right? So your neurons, when you ever see like a neuron animation, let's see here. Whenever you're looking at like, whenever they're showing like neurons working and stuff, they always kind of draw it like this. Kind of looks like a lightning bolt that's sort of traveling, right? Well, that's actually because it is literally electricity. It's using electrochemical charge, and it does that because sodium and potassium are kind of like little batteries. And so you flip sodium and potassium back and forth and it creates electricity. So if you've got this membrane that's separating sodium on one side and potassium on the other, and you use a pump to move sodium from one side to the other, well, nature's like, gross, everything's uneven now. And so it pumps it back in the opposite direction. And that's the electric signal that we're talking about. So it basically flips it back and forth, and then that electricity travels from neuron to neuron to neuron to neuron until eventually it hits one of your muscle cells. And then boom, that causes an actual contraction to occur. So this is actually kind of what that looks like. You can see that's what your electrolytes are. Sodium, which is, potassium, which is this little K right here, and sodium, which is the little Na. And so you can see there's a lot of sodium on this side and very little sodium over here. There's a lot of potassium on this side. And so there's a negative charge over here and a positive charge over here. Now, if you were to take this and put like a pump right here, let's say we straddle like this wall with a pump, and we pumped all the sodium over here, all the potassium over here, and we pumped all the sodium over here. Now, this little negative side is actually positive, and this little positive side is actually negative. And nature hates that. So nature will want to move it back in the other direction. All of those electrons will want to go this way. And there you go. We just generated electricity. This is why when you have batteries, you have like the positive end and the negative end, and you need one battery facing this way and you need the other battery facing the other way, because that's what moves against the way nature wants it to go, which is what's creating that electricity. It's also actually kind of similar if you want to think of it as like creating static electricity. When you rub your feet on carpet, you go zap your mom. I did that a lot. That was like I said, my mom, I tortured that poor woman growing up. But like, yeah, like that is static electricity. It's kind of similar. You're actually kind of creating a little bit of friction, moving electrons around and stuff. Your plasma membrane is how we're going to separate materials. Now, also inside of all of your cells, you are going to have what is known as your nucleus. Your nucleus is often the largest organelle, but not always. And it contains your DNA. Probably the most important part of our cells. It's the brain of your cell. It tells your cells how to grow, what they're supposed to look like, how they're supposed to react and respond, live and die. Your nucleus has your blueprint. And so like your cells look a little bit different from mine, which look a little bit different than my roommates, which are a little very different than that dog back there's, you know, like, but either way, the DNA is what's telling those cells how to grow, how to assemble, and what they are supposed to look like. So when you have sort of like a baseline cell, does it become a muscle cell? Does it become an enzyme? Well, it's all going to be depending on whatever that DNA is supposed to look like. Now within that membrane is filled with, it is absolutely filled with all of this fluid that we call cytosol. Now, chances are this is something that does get a little confusing just because people get a little relaxed about how they describe the material within our cells. The fluid itself is called cytosol, and it's basically this suspension of like mostly water, but it's got some electrolytes in it, you know, sodium, potassium, things like that, some enzymes that are floating around in there. And that's kind of what that fluid is, not just pure water. But when there is stuff in that fluid, which obviously inside the cell, you know, you got a nucleus, you've got mitochondria, you've got, or, you know, all these other types of organelles, all these, you know, special little organelles that we're looking at, right? Look at all these little guys. When you have that fluid filled with all these little organelles, we give it a special name. We call it the cytoplasm. So cytoplasm is the fluid portion of our cells that have all the organelles in it. The fluid itself is cytosol. And sometimes, I'll be honest, you'll get questions on tests and things like that, and it'll say like, you know, where is glycolysis taking place? For instance, Derek, don't worry about that for now. We're going to come to that much later when it's in a much better time. But for those of you who have been through our physiology class, we talk about how like glycolysis takes place in the cytoplasm, or we could say that it takes place in the cytosol. Don't let either of those confuse you. Think of them as basically the same thing, except that if we are being very specific about how we're labeling this, cytosol is the fluid, cytoplasm is the fluid when it has stuff in it, and it almost always does. So your cytoplasm is all the goo within your cells. Your cells are this kind of wet, swampy area. Now, organelles, right? Kind of like your organs inside of your body, your cells all have these specialized little structures that do really cool little things inside of them, right? And so they are special structures that perform different functions. So there's a lot of them out there. There's what's called the endoplasmic reticulum, which is a big fancy word. And basically it's all this like little, it's this like kind of almost like wavy walls that are kind of near the nucleus. And, you know, they've got, you know, the smooth version and the rough version. The rough version has these other organelles attached to it called ribosomes. Their job is to assemble DNA. DNA's instructions. So DNA is like, hey, we need to make a new protein. And the ribosomes are like, great, boss, how do we do that? And then the DNA gives it the blueprint. You've got a Golgi apparatus, which is basically preparing proteins to be transported where they need to go. You got lysosomes, which is kind of like your immune system within your individual cells. Vesicles, centrioles, they're giving it all this kind of interesting shape. Lots of different organelles out there, but the one that's important to us, extremely important to us, is the mitochondria. Now, I hate to say this because I do not want to sound like a high school biology teacher, but it is the powerhouse of the freaking cell. Sorry to be a cliche, but that is what your mitochondria is. It's an organelle that is responsible for producing this really cool molecule called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And so ATP is how our body does literally everything it does. It's this really high energy molecule that our body is able to break down and release all that energy, and then it uses that energy to do stuff, everything that you do, everything from me talking right now to you simply sitting upright and listening, processing information, all of that takes ATP. And so mitochondria is responsible for producing that ATP, okay? Probably the coolest freaking organelle out there. So Our mitochondria basically take in glucose and they take in a little bit of oxygen and they spit out energy, spit out ATP, so that we can do cellular work. And that's, probably the most important organelle. And so when you are in the middle of a workout and you need to make sure that, you are burning lots and lots and lots of energy, you need to be able to produce sufficient amounts of ATP to be able to get through that workout. And that is going to be determined by your diet and the type of exercise that you are performing. Let's say you want to focus on like getting really good at creating a ton of ATP in a really short period of time, but then you're going to kind of burn it out and get kind of exhausted afterwards. Great. That's a super good way to learn how to lift really freaking heavy. Or maybe you want to create sustained ATP so you can run a marathon. That's a very different type of metabolism. So your mitochondria and how we sort of affect them, this is part of the reason why we're talking about cells today. Because there are going to be things that you can do in the gym that will change the way all of this cellular biology kind of works, which is super fun to talk about. Now, like I said yesterday, function following form, we got a really great example of that in the world of cells. So there are a lot of different shapes within your cells. Your cell's shape is going to be related to its function. It's going to look a certain way so that it can perform a certain way. Take a look right here. You can see here's a nerve cell. This is a neuron, right? It's got the nucleus in it. It's got a little nucleolus there. It's also going to have mitochondria, which you can't really see in this picture, but it's going to have all the normal stuff a cell is going to have, but it's got these special little shapes to it, these little fingers that reach out, and that make it really good at being able to connect to other neurons and other materials throughout the body. So it can connect to your skin, and maybe a neuron causes your skin to contract up and form goosebumps if it gets too cold, or maybe it causes the pores to expand. Neurons are going to zap your other cells in order to do that. They're going to zap tissues to make things happen. So that's why our nerve cells are our communication network. That's why they are our control center. So neurons are really good at grabbing one another and forming like a big long chain. So it's like if you're playing a game of telephone, you're right, and you're like watermelon, and then the other person's like watermelon, right? And it's sending signal down the line until that person at the end is like watermelon. Like that's it's a game of telephone. That's exactly how your neurons work. They're sending information from person to person to person, or from neuron to neuron to neuron. You've also got here, you can see this is what's called epithelial cells. This is like the tissues that make up like the lining of our walls. Your organs, for instance, have like a wall, or even just like the walls of your skin cells, right? They're really big, they're really flat. They have a lot of what's the special protein called collagen in them, which is what makes them really good at kind of stretching out, right? You can kind of pull and stretch on them and they don't really, they kind of just snap back to their original shape. That's thanks to collagen. And we do produce less of it as we get older, which explains why we got so many wrinkles and stuff. Then we've got muscle cells. Muscle cells, all the normal organelles. Again, they're going to have mitochondria. They're going to have nucleuses, but there's going to be, speaking of muscle, a ton of mitochondria in muscle cells, because muscle cells are major energy burners. They take a lot of energy to run. And you can kind of see these interesting little stripes right here. Those are little proteins that are really good at grabbing one another and then pulling in one direction. And then they can let go, and they can grab and they can let go. And what that can do is if it grabs and it grabs and it grabs, and then it slides this one protein that way, well, now the muscle cell is going to kind of shorten. So if I slid a bunch of proteins this way and I slid a bunch of proteins this way and they slide across one another, I'm taking this muscle cell from being this long and now I'm making it this long. And that is what we call a contraction. You can kind of see that when you see like a muscle bunch up, right? You can literally see that contraction happening, that sliding action, because they're kind of bunching up in the middle and it's drawing. And that's great because now I can grab a bone and I can drag it and move it around and make it do stuff, right? We got red blood cells, which are really cool. These are some of the smallest cells in your body. They actually don't have very many organelles. That's actually what's so interesting about red blood cells. You'll notice they kind of look like a little sort of bloody breath mint, kind of like a filled in donut. And the reason they have that shape is because they used to be kind of a regular looking cell. And then right as they're about to kind of enter the bloodstream, they go, bleh, and they spit out all their organelles, and that causes them to collapse. That makes them very, very good at having this little dent that can hold on to oxygen. And then that can transport that oxygen throughout our body. That's also why they don't live very long. You are making new red blood cells really pretty much all the time, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, because your blood cells die pretty quickly because they don't have any organelles to kind of sustain themselves. And then if you look at the shape, here's a sperm cell, right? Sperm cell, which is kind of like a torpedo. It's really good at breaking through the wall of a big egg. Also not a very large cell. It's actually going to be a little bit small, you know, it looks larger in this picture. It's actually going to be smaller than a red blood cell as well. And then the egg that it's going into is usually actually one of the largest cells that the human body creates. But that is sort of what all of your cells kind of look like, right? They got all these really cool different shapes and sizes and different things that they do. Now, one of the coolest things that your cells do is they are selectively permeable. So to permeate something is to get inside of something else or to saturate it, right? Your cells will allow that to happen with stuff that they want it to happen with. They are selectively permeable. Not everything can get through, but the stuff that we want to get through can. Think about your digestive system, right? If you eat like a plastic wrapper, you know, for the most part, it's going to come out the other end looking the same. Our body does not have the materials necessary to break down plastics. Really, not very many things on this planet do. But certain materials can get into your bloodstream. Proteins, fats, carbs, vitamins, minerals, water. Those things can get into your blood. Things that are not, they don't really get into your bloodstream very well because your cells are choosing what to let in. They are selectively permeable, right? So there's a membrane on the outside of all of our cells, that plasma membrane, and it has all those channels in it. And those channels have a specific shape so that certain materials can enter the cell and certain materials can leave. And it does this through a process that we call diffusion. So diffusion is how a solute, a material, something like a substance, salt, really good example, travels from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So my favorite phrase, form follows function. Love to say that. I'm sorry, function follows form. Really love to say that. It describes how everything in the freaking universe works. Something will look one way so they can act another way. If you want to understand how the universe works, remember that. One other thing, if you want to know a little bit better about how the universe we live in works, stuff likes to move from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration because nature hates a gradient. Nature does not like it when there's a lot of stuff over here and very little stuff over here. Nature is a socialist. Not trying to make any political statements here, but trust me, that is why gravity works the way it does. It's why chemistry works the way it does. It's just how the universe is. Stuff will naturally move from where there's a lot of stuff to very little stuff. Think about if you had like a sock full of marbles, right? It's all those marbles are bunched up. If you cut a hole in that sock, it would go and they would all spread themselves out as far away from each other as they can, moving from an area of high concentration where they're all bunched up to an area of low concentration where they're not bunched up at all anymore. Same thing is true of liquid. Same thing is true of stuff, you know, little materials. So if something passively moves from an area of high concentration where there's a lot of it to an area where there's very little, that is what is known as diffusion. One of the reasons why drinking salt water is so freaking dangerous is because water will naturally move into salt water so that it can push that high concentration of salt away, right? All the salt's kind of bunched up and it naturally draws water towards it because that's the way nature works. It's trying to push those salt particles away from one another. And if your cells have less water in them more water in them than salt water does, the water from in your cells will actually diffuse and move into that salt water. And so it dehydrates you. And now there's water outside of your cells, plenty, but there's no water inside of your cells. And without that, your cells can't function the way they're supposed to. Now, there's some special versions of this. There's facilitated diffusion. This is actually where a transporter kind of pushes something against it. So a transporter might grab a material. It doesn't naturally want to move into the cell, and it'll move it into the cell. That usually takes a little bit of energy. Like I said, we need ATP to be able to move stuff around. Sodium and potassium are happy to be on these, sodium's happy to be out here. Potassium's happy to be in here, but your body needs to create an electric signal. So it will actually facilitate a diffusion. It will move it against its concentration, which is why nature hates it so much. And that's why it wants to flip it back. And that's what creates electricity. That's what creates that type of electricity. Osmosis, this is actually where water will move down its concentration gradient. Water moving into and out of a cell is an example of diffusion. Osmosis is just kind of a fancy name for water moving. But if something moves, it's diffusing. If it's water, we call it osmosis. You can think of them as basically the same thing. Because most of the time when we're talking about moving stuff, we're going to be talking about water. There's also filtration. Filtration is where like a mechanical force sort of, pushes against something so that only certain materials can move through. Your kidneys, for instance, are really good examples of filters inside of your body where fluid and water will be moving through. And basically it's pulling out all this material that we call urea. And then it just kind of adds it to some of our passive water. And then we use that to move it into our bladder. And then we get that out of our body. So that's filtration. This is why, like, when you have too much protein in your diet, it could possibly damage your kidneys because your body will actually break down protein instead of breaking down carbohydrates. And because protein has that extra nitrogen that we talked about earlier, it's got to get filtered. And then your kidneys are just working overtime. So here's a really good example of diffusion. This is a chunk of salt. If you dropped a chunk of salt into water, it would sit there for a second, but then slowly over time, that water would actually move into the salt particle and it would break it up and bunch it apart until eventually it's all of those salt particles are evenly distributed at the same length away from each other throughout that water. And that's an example of what we see in diffusion. That's why water molecules are moving into the salt. Here's an example of facilitated diffusion, right? This is where like a protein channel or a pump is actually taking a solute and using a little bit of energy to pump it from one side to the other. Again, moving something from a high concentration to a lower concentration, or maybe actually going from a low concentration to high concentration. If it's going against nature's will, nature will want to move it back naturally. Here's an example of osmosis. Let's say you have like a semi-permeable membrane, selectively permeable membrane. If you had a membrane separating a tube of water, and in this side you poured fresh water, and over here you poured salt water, well, all of that water will actually naturally move this way. It will actually come over here, and that's why you can see this level is now, it looks higher. It's actually not. There's actually the same amount of water on both sides in this picture. But the water is being taken up by all these little particles right here. That's how we create filters, by the way. That's how your Brita filter works. And then there's osmotic pressure where you could actually push in the opposite direction, filter things out. And then certain materials will be able to move through and other materials wouldn't. So that's really important because this is describing how we are able to balance out our fluids, which is why you need to stay hydrated. Guys, you should be drinking about 3.7 liters of water a day. That's about 4 of these. Ladies, you should be drinking about 2.7 liters a day. That's about 3 of these. Little bit less, but pretty close. A gallon of water a day is pretty appropriate for most men. And about 3/4 of a gallon is pretty appropriate for most women. And that ensures that we are staying well hydrated and there is enough fluid in our cells, but not too much, so that our cells can function the way they are really designed to. So if we take a look at osmosis here, there is a low solute and a high amount of water. Let's say this is perfectly distilled, just water. The only thing in there is water, right? And then over here, this is salt water. Well, what's going to happen is that those water molecules are naturally going to move in this direction because they're going to try to push all of that salt away. So we would call this solution right here, we would call that hypertonic. It's a solution that has a really high concentration of something else, right? Your cells are somewhat hypertonic compared to regular fresh water because your cells have all the organelles and stuff inside of them. And there's fluid in there, right? There's the cytosol, but because there's other stuff taking up space, it's technically a little bit more hypertonic, and that's why water is attracted to our cells. And then there's hypotonic solutions. Hypotonic solutions are solutions that have a lower concentration of something else. There's not a lot of like water in one area, that's hypotonic, right? And that's where something is going to want to move. That's where it is going to want to move to a hypertonic area. And then there's also isotonic, which is where the concentration is about the same. So salt water is hypertonic compared to fresh water because it has a higher concentration of salt in it. There's salt taking up some of the space. And then there's hypotonic, which is like fresh water, which is hypotonic compared to salt water because there's not any stuff in it. Take a look here. This is what happens to your blood cells when you get overhydrated, or this is what happens to your blood cells when you get drink salt water. So here, this is an isotonic solution, right? This is a normal red blood cell, and then there's some particles outside of it, but the concentration of there's particles inside that blood cell, there's fluid inside that blood cell, but the concentration is about the same. Like, I don't know, let's say each of these is 1 inch apart, right? Same thing's true inside here. Cool. Over here, if you were to take a red blood cell and drop it into fresh water, and I mean like pure water with no salt, no materials in it, well, now there's a way higher concentration of water outside of the cell and a lower concentration of water inside the cell. So nature is going to move water into the cell, and that cell will expand and it will actually get bloated and it will not be able to function the way it's supposed to. That's a swollen red blood cell. That's not good. That's actually what happens when you become overhydrated, which freaking never happens. I don't know anybody who's overhydrated. It can happen, but it's pretty rare. But that's a hypotonic solution. All that water rushes into the cell so they can push all the organelles and other materials at the same concentration as whatever that water is. And then here is if you dropped a red blood cell into a hypertonic solution. If you dropped a red blood cell into salt water, because there's so much salt out here, the water inside of the cell is going to rush out of the cell to push all that salt apart. And that is going to and this is why drinking salt water will dehydrate you. There's an example of filtration. The big stuff can't get through the filter, the little stuff can. And then there's a couple other ways that we move stuff around, but this is a little bit too complicated compared to what we need to talk about. But there are ways that we can kind of move materials around as well. There's what's known as active transport, which is where a cell will grab something and carry it from one way to the other. There's endocytosis, where a cell will actually grab, it'll sort of fold itself over something and then it will open up on the inside. It'll kind of eat something else. That's how your immune system works. There's exocytosis, which is how your cell actually poops stuff out. So if there's it'll kind of go inside here and then it would open it and release it to the outside. So that's endo and exocytosis, right? Here's a good example of that. This is endocytosis, where this particle comes in here, pinches it off, and then opens it up. Here's exocytosis, where basically it goes to the edge and then it opens itself up and poops it out. And that is, those are how we move materials around. That's actually it, So it was a lot today. That was probably, I think that's the most information we'll get in one day in this course. But checking in with you guys. How's everybody feeling? Any questions? There's a little bit of a
Questions for good.
I'm good. All right.
I'm good.
Cool. Bit of a blistering pace today. Just because we had a lot to get through. So guys, homework number 1 is up on Canvas today. So find your way over there and knock that out. Derek, if I can have you stick around after class, I want to walk you through how to get set up on Canvas and how to do your homework and stuff. Answer any questions you might have about that and get you set up with your account. But does anybody have any questions other than that? Everybody feeling good? All right. Well, let's go ahead and kill the
Good,
recording.
good. Thank you. Good.
And
Okay, thank you.